Um, Today we're working on a color reduction woodcut, and this is the wood that I'm working on. It's a piece of 1/4-inch birch plywood that I laminate with wood glue to 1/8 inch tempered masonite. That has to be done so that the wood does not warp. So the very first thing I do is get the 1/4-inch plywood, cut to the size I'm going to need to work. This is going to be a bleed print, so I've planned on that. And I laminate it to the masonite with weight and let it sit for a good 24 hours. Then I'm ready to take my drawing and transfer it to the clean wood. And the way I do that is I have the drawing all rendered on tracing paper in order to transfer to the wood. I've taken that drawing from a master drawing. There might be simpler ways to do this, but this is the way I like to work. So I've created a master drawing, scaled it, and ready to transfer to wood. I take the trace and I place it on the wood with a border laid out, with registration marks laid out. This is called a T-mark registration. You always mark one corner with T's so that you always place the paper in the same way every time. Then I take the tracing paper down and I take pieces of carbon paper and I lay that underneath the tracing paper all throughout, and I begin to trace over my marks. Every artist is different. I could simply trace the outline of this American bison and go for it. But I like to have a little bit more to work with. Every artist wants a different starting point. I like to lay out a lot of my black onto the board, so I have a pretty strong guide. Once that's transferred with the carbon paper, it is on the surface of the wood. Then I take the board that's been prepped this way. I shellac the entire surface. And the shellac, it has to be shellac because shellac is resistant to mineral spirits, which is how I clean up the ink. By shellacking the drawing down, it means that the drawing will stay throughout the printing process. So every time I print, I can clean off the ink, but I'll still see what's left of my drawing beneath, which is very nice. So what I'm doing right now, I've transferred the drawing, I shellacked the board, I then take a sharp, brand new straight blade, and I go along the whole surface of the board to smooth it as if I was finishing a piece of furniture. And I get it smooth as glass. And then I'm ready to cut. And what you're cutting for, essentially, you cut for white. You're cutting away and you leave black. So it's a subtractive method. So I've already started cutting quite a bit. I've cut for white in the eyes. I've cut for white in the horns. I've cut for white in most of the background, in the hooves, on some of the texture. I'm going to cut a little bit more just before we go to printing. What I want to show you is I'm using a Dremel tool. You can hand carve. There are wonderful wood cutting tools. The old masters used hand engravers or wood cutting tools. But 21st century artists have access to what's called a Dremel. And you can buy various size bits for large area cutting and for very delicate cutting. The benefit is, of course, less fatigue on your hand. The other benefit is you can cut curves, delicate, curvilinear lines that are much more difficult to cut with a hand tool. And I believe if Albrecht Dürer had had a Dremel, he would have done his own woodcuts with the Dremel. The reason I say this, he didn't cut his own woodcuts. He hired artisans to do it because it's a very hard process. So I embrace the Dremel and encourage students to do it. I also teach the traditional methods too. But when you're working at this scale, a Dremel is quite useful. So I'm going to cut a few areas of white, and usually I'm wearing this for most of my cutting, because of the wood dust. But when I'm doing really small, just incidental little cuts, I don't really need this because I'm not kicking up a lot of wood dust. But when I do all the major cutting, and my students, we all wear dust masks. Okay, here we go. And I like to use my left hand to steady the tool so that I have really great control. And you can see not a whole lot of dust is flying up at me when I do very small cuts. The most important thing is I tend to err. I take my blade, by the way, after every area of cutting, you want to take the straight blade across it to take down any burrs from the wood that would get into your ink. And again, for large areas, this can be quite messy, but we're just doing some small cuts. Usually I have a vacuum around to get all the wood dust up. The one thing you have to remember is once the wood is cut, it's cut. You can't go back and fill it in. So I always err a little bit on cutting a little less because I know I can always cut more. So we're ready to print. Okay, now that we've cut, we're ready to run our first color. So you have to set up the press if you're using a press. You have two options with reduction color woodcut or woodcut in general. You can hand print it or you can run it on a press. The traditional way of hand printing, you lay the paper after you've rolled out the ink and you can rub it with either a trusty spoon, which ours is very worn down from all the rubbing we've done. You can use the spoon. There's also a rubbing brayer, woodcut brayer, that you can rub across it. But we have a press. It's essentially set up with a big roller that's traditionally the etching press, set up as an etching press, and you can raise the roller to accommodate the wood. And it's really nice because it gives you nice smooth pressure over the entire surface. Then you can still use the spoon once you've printed it, once you've run it through the press, to maybe get incidental areas that might need some hand rubbing. These two end pieces are essentially the same kind of wood and masonite, so it's the same height, laminated. They're scrap pieces. I use them as a way of engaging the roller and setting consistent pressure, so I don't just run in to the edge of my wood, and it keeps your paper from being harmed as well, particularly if you're working with paper that bleeds over the edge of your wood. So that's what this is, and the plate is ready to go. I'm going to, since the scale of this is so big, I'm going to roll it up right here on the press, ink it up right on the press. Very often I don't do that. I ink on a separate surface, place my wood, and then run it, but the scale means I have to ink it up right here. Once we pull our first color, we can see the whole process in action.